I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today we have a special guest, Professor Van Norden, who is a professor of philosophy and also has an appointment in the Chinese and Japanese department at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Professor Van Norden, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you just recently published a book, Classical Chinese for Everybody.
Classical Chinese for Everyone, a guide for absolute beginners.
And I've been reading through and using it as kind of a study guide, and I've gotten through the first 4 lessons so far. Your classical Chinese guide is a little different from some of the others that our listeners might have gone through. One of the things that I think you do that's quite fantastic is you start by assuming that the reader is not necessarily a fluent Chinese speaker. Can you tell me a bit about that decision?
Yeah, as many of your listeners probably know, there's an important difference between modern vernacular Chinese and classical Chinese. Roughly, it's like the difference between, say, contemporary Italian and Latin. The way that people normally teach classical Chinese in colleges and universities is that they make you study 2 years of modern Chinese or maybe 2 years of modern Japanese before you can start learning classical Chinese. But there's really no reason to do that. Just like there are people who want to learn Latin or classical Greek without wanting to learn Italian or contemporary spoken Greek, so are there people who would like to learn classical Chinese without necessarily wanting to know the modern language. And so I decided to design a textbook that was distinctive in that you could learn classical Chinese with no previous background in modern Chinese or modern Japanese.
One of the things that I think is really innovative about this, it's not only great for people who don't actually speak modern Chinese, but even those of us who do speak modern Chinese, if you're not completely fluent in the language, if you're not a native speaker, it's just a lot easier to learn another language without having to go through this other language.
Yeah, I think it's important to write a text that's accessible to students. And I'm old enough that I learned the ins and outs of English grammar, and I diagrammed sentences when I was in grade school, and I know all the parts of speech. But I know that lots of students today, not only do they often not know modern Chinese, even if they've studied a language, they may not understand grammatical terms really well. And when I first started to write this textbook, and if you want, we can talk about the history of how I ended up writing it. But when I first started to write it, I found that even students who didn't know modern Chinese really enjoyed this textbook because the explanations of the grammar are written in ordinary, everyday English that you can understand instead of the kind of complicated language that a linguist might use or a classical philologist who just who knows a lot about grammatical terminology and assumes that everybody else does too. But you just can't assume that anymore.
I definitely agree. I think your text is fantastic. It allows younger students to approach classical without having to go through this kind of linguistic training.
Yeah, and I remember when I first learned classical, I used Shattuck's textbook, which is, if people don't know, it's 3 volumes. There's the text volume, the grammar volume, and the vocabulary volume. And it is a great book, but they're really not accessible to most students nowadays. And I remember even as an undergraduate, my instructor, one student in the class was having problems, and the instructor said, well, just go and read really carefully Shattuck's grammatical explanations. And she said in frustration, but I don't understand his grammatical explanations. And I understood it. Unless you've learned a lot of grammar, a lot of these textbooks are very hard to understand. And so you need to write in a way that the average student, you say things like, he hit the ball is the direct object. You have to tell them things like that because they don't necessarily know what a direct object is or an indirect object or a verb complement. You can't assume your students know that going in.
Yeah, and I definitely still have nightmares of going through Shattuck's grammar and trying to understand what the heck he was saying. I want to point something out, though. This is not unrigorous, right? Like you have nerd notes in the footnotes, which I loved. kudos for calling them nerd notes. I think more people should do that. And you dive really in depth into the grammar and kind of what's going on. Sometimes you talk about pronunciation in the nerd notes. I think it's accessible, but it's not a dumbing down of classical Chinese. This is a really, I think you did a great job.
Thank you. Yeah, I tried to do that. And like you say, I own the word nerd. I think that those of us who study history know that nerds have been running the show ever since the dawn of time. Since, the Egyptian scribes, we've been running everything. Don't let the knights fool you. The priests and the scribes are the ones who are actually running things. But yeah, so in the nerd notes, I go into some detail, and also on the Hackett title support page, I'm adding additional materials that go into even more detail. If you really want to get into the minutiae of the grammar, the information is there. But I try to shunt it into the notes so students aren't too intimidated as they're reading things for the first time.
I wanted to ask you about the selections that you used. So in the text, it looked fairly analects heavy. The first couple of passages are pretty much all analects.
Yes.
And I think that's great because that's, such a classical, it is the text that is the touchstone of all of Chinese literature. I wasn't sure though, when I was learning classical Chinese, and I guess I still am learning. I guess classical is one of those things we're all still learning. But
I think that's true, yeah.
So my question was this: I had heard that Mengzi was more, in terms of grammar, a better teacher because Confucius is a bit more archaic. Could you describe the decision you made in focusing more on the Confucian text and less on the Mengzi? Not that there is Mengzi in there, and there is. I wanted to compliment you. I think every book should end with Zhuangzi's butterfly dream. So I thought it was very appropriate that was the last lesson. But why Confucius?
Well, one of the reasons I picked it is I want students to be motivated to learn this material. One of the notes I got from the referees were largely very, very, very positive, but one said, you should give them more manufactured sentences so that they can see lots of, different constructions. But people are excited. They know who Confucius is. And if you can tell somebody, I'm learning classical Chinese, and from lesson 1, I'm reading actual passages from classical Chinese philosophers, especially Confucius, that excites them, that motivates them. And so that's another distinctive feature of the book, as you're suggesting, which is that every lesson uses actual classical Chinese texts. I simplify one passage in one lesson, but then I give the complete unsimplified version of it in a later lesson. So students are actually learning real passages, not funny made-up stories that are just made up by contemporary people. So I think that's very motivating, and because people know already who Confucius is, it's good to start with that because they know who that is. And then many people know who Lao Tzu, the supposed author of the Tao Te Ching, is. And so then we go into that. And then later I introduce people who, as you point out, are very, very important in the history of Chinese thought and very interesting, but less well known in the West, like the Confucian Mengzi, the Taoist Zhuangzi, and the great poet Li Bai, whose name, as I point out in a nerd note, is sometimes also pronounced Li Bo.
And you explained that, the difference in the reading pronunciation.
Exactly. And that's kind of old-fashioned. So I've had some, I believe I point this out in the note, I know some contemporary Chinese people where, even very well-educated ones, if you refer to the poet as Li Bo, you'll just get kind of a weird look, like, who are you talking about? I say, oh, Li Bai. Like, oh, yeah, why didn't you say so, Li Bai? But there are these traditional readings of the classical characters that we should know about. And so many people are familiar with the poet Li Bai, but they know him as Li Po because that's how his name is written in the older Wei Giles romanization. But it's pronounced like Li Bo, and that Bo is a literary reading of the character Bai. Again, all this, as you point out, is I explain in one of the nerd notes, so if people really want to get into it, they can find that out. But if they just want to read the poem, they can read the primary text and learn, okay, this would normally be read Li Bai in modern Chinese, and here's his most famous.
You also introduced Zhu Xi, right?
Yes.
Zhu Xi is a commentary on, and I think you're introducing him in the commentary on Confucius, which I thought was interesting because at least in my training in classical, I've never been taught how to read the commentaries, which as in that passage and in other passages, you point out the importance of commentary and how it helps this is not, I'm thinking about lesson 4, there's a point where Confucius is saying yo, and it looks like it might be a preposition, but if you read the commentary, it tells you this is actually someone's name.
Yes, exactly. And another thing I try to do in the book is I learned things at the hands of some really great teachers when I was an undergraduate and also as a graduate student. And there are many things that are often passed on by word of mouth from a generous senior scholar to younger scholars. But sometimes, as you point out, they don't get passed on. So sometimes people don't teach their students how to read the classical commentaries. But the classical commentaries are written in a very distinctive style. And if you don't know them, there's so much interesting information about the passages that's hidden from you. Here's an example. I don't think I give this example in the book, but there's a famous passage in the Analects in D.C. Lau's translation, which is a great translation in which I first used. It's a translation of the Analects of the Sayings of Confucius. This passage says, "The way of the master is doing one's best and using oneself as a measure to gauge others." And I was like, that's interesting. I wonder what the Chinese looks like. And I looked at the Chinese, and the Chinese says, 夫子之道,忠恕而已矣, which is the way of the master, 忠恕, and that's it. So that long phrase, doing one's best and using oneself as a measure to gauge others, that long phrase is a translation of 2 words in the original Chinese. And for the life of me, I couldn't understand how D.C. Lau got that interpretation. It turns out he's following the commentary of Zhu Xi, this 12th century extremely influential commentator who had a huge influence on how people read the classics. And in his commentary, Zhu Xi says, well, the first character, Zhong, yeah, it's loyalty, but here it doesn't just mean loyalty, it means doing your best to follow the way. And then Shu, sometimes translated sympathy, Zhu Xi refers to another Analects passage and says, well, this other Analects passage teaches us that it means not inflicting on others what you yourself do not like. But Lau didn't say that he was following the commentary. And a lot of textbooks will give you this passage, but they won't tell you that they're following Zhu Xi's commentary in interpreting it. So that's one of the things I wanted people to know about is how do you read a classic commentary, and just to be aware that these things exist and they continue to influence how things are translated.
Can I ask, what's your favorite passage in the book?
Oh, wow. That's hard
to put you on the spot.
Yeah, that's okay. I think, well, one of my favorite passages, I don't think I included it in the book, but it's you could easily read it after reading the book. It's the one where Confucius says that if you study but do not think, then you'll be confused. But if you think but you do not study, then you will be in danger. That's one of my favorite Analects passages of all time. But in the book itself, I think the passage that I enjoy the most is Analects 5:13, which is in lesson 9. It's this really intriguing passage. One of Confucius's disciples says basically that you can succeed in hearing about the master's displays of virtue, but you can't succeed in hearing about the master's words on human nature and the way of heaven. So the disciple says you can't succeed, you can't get to hear the master talk about human nature and the way of heaven. And you would think that what that means is that the master didn't talk about human nature and the way of heaven. As I explained, because I also give Zhu Xi's commentary on this passage, the way people like Zhu Xi read it is they say, oh no, of course the master had something to say about human nature and the way of heaven. It's just that he didn't talk about it to beginners. He didn't explain it to people if they weren't prepared to understand these deep teachings. The way I put it is I say it's kind of like if somebody is eating a really good steak and they say, oh my gosh, you can't get steaks this good anymore. What you mean is, wow, it's really hard to get a steak this good. So likewise, Zhu Xi thinks that what the passage is saying is the disciples saying, you can't get to hear the master talk about human nature and the way of heaven. And here I am hearing the master talk about human nature and the way of heaven. He never talks about those things. I'm so lucky he's explaining those things to me now. And why is Zhu Xi driven to this really weird reading of this passage? Because Zhu Xi thinks that the great appendix to the Book of Changes was written by Confucius. And he also thinks that the teachings of Mengzi, this later Confucian on human nature, are just expressions of the esoteric or hidden teachings of Confucius about human nature. So Zhu Xi is committed to the view that although we don't see them in the Analects, Confucius had these very sophisticated, elaborate views on human nature and the way of heaven. So he must have had them. And so what the disciple must be saying is he must be exclaiming how excited he is to finally learn these hidden teachings that the master doesn't teach to anyone. So I just think it's so fun to see what Zhu Xi made of this passage that clearly seems to be saying one thing, that the master doesn't talk about this. And Zhu Xi interprets it as saying just the opposite, that, oh, the master does talk about it, just not very often.
That brings up a great question. Since we've talked so much about Zhu Xi, I'll just point out to the listeners who aren't familiar with Zhu Xi, you mentioned he was a 12th century scholar. He is very well known for sort of reinventing Confucianism. The word Neo-Confucianism in English is often associated with him, though I understand that to be problematic.
Yeah, exactly right. So what happened in China, I mean, people often assume that Confucianism has always been dominant in the Chinese tradition, and that's just not the case. Confucianism was only one of many schools competing for intellectual supremacy in the Warring States period in ancient China. And then in the Han Dynasty, Confucianism became nominally the official ideology of the state, but people had very different interpretations of what it meant. One scholar had this great phrase, I wish I'd come up with this, but I didn't. He referred to Confucianism in the Han Dynasty as content-free Confucianism. You could be a Confucian, but all that meant was you're committed to the fact that Confucius is a sage and to the fact that he had something interesting to say, but beyond that, people didn't agree about what Confucius said. And then in the Six Dynasties period after the fall of the Han, Buddhism became dominant. So that by the Tang Dynasty, Buddhism was really the dominant intellectual, religious, and social movement. Then towards the end of the Tang, and then gaining steam in the Sung Dynasty, and the Tang ends in 906 AD. But by the end of the Tang and then beginning in the Sung Dynasty, what we have is a Confucian reaction against Buddhism, blaming Buddhism for the social problems that China had at that time, and trying to revive Confucianism. However, by that point, Confucianism had been steeped in Buddhist ideas for centuries, so that the form of Confucianism that developed, which we in the West call Neo-Confucianism, had absorbed all these key concepts from Buddhism. And I talk about this in one of the lessons in the book, so that the later Confucians read their own tradition through Buddhist lenses. So what I sometimes say is Neo-Confucianism, the Confucianism of people like Zhu Xi, is Confucianism seen through Buddhist lenses. It's kind of like the way that people in the later Christian tradition read the Bible through the lens of Aristotelian and Platonic thought. So likewise, the Confucians read their tradition through Buddhist concepts.
When you're looking at the Zhu Xi from the passage that you quote in the book in Lesson 9, how much do you actually trust Zhu Xi in terms of getting at Confucius's original meaning?
I think Zhu Xi is very insightful, and so he often sees things that it takes me a long time to even realize what it is he's seen. But that being said, I think he often does distort the original text because of these concepts he's interpreted from Buddhism. And I'll give you a couple of examples. one of the key concepts in Buddhism is selfishness. So Buddhism argues that there is no self, at least there is no individual self. So the primary human vice is selfishness. It's a clinging to the illusory notion that we have independent selves and trying to get goods to possess by this illusory self that we think we have. And the character for selfishness does occur in ancient Chinese texts, but it doesn't really mean selfishness. It means private as opposed to public. And so your family's interests would be si, as opposed to the interests of the state, which would be gong. And this is something that the philosopher Han Feizi talks about, the family interest, the si interest, versus the public interest, the gong interest. But then when Buddhism comes in, they take this character, si, and they adopt it to refer to the concept of individual selfishness. And then this notion that selfishness is the primary human vice gets adopted by Neo-Confucian thinkers like Zhu Xi. But Kongzi doesn't talk about selfishness as the primary human vice. Mengzi doesn't talk about selfishness as the primary human vice. But the Neo-Confucians, they talk about selfish thoughts and selfish desires all the time. So their own comprehension of the Confucian tradition has been warped by this Buddhist influence. The result is a philosophy that is intrinsically quite interesting, but not, I think, what Kongzi, Confucius himself, or Mengzi had in mind originally.
So definitely we have to read Zhu Xi when we're reading Kongzi, when we're reading Confucius, but we should always just kind of be aware that he's essentially creating a new philosophy while simultaneously explaining an old philosophy.
I think so, yes. I mean, he is very insightful on some things, and this book has been, I've been very gratified. It's done quite well. There's some talk about having a sequel, and one passage I'm thinking of including if we do a sequel is a passage where it's from the Great Learning, which is another Confucian classic, and it says that you should love the good like you love a lovely sa. And the term sa is, it can mean color, as in the modern Chinese expression yan sa, and that's the way some people translate it. But if you say you're supposed to love good like you love a lovely color, what does that mean? You know, like what is it about colors that are so interesting? Eventually, I figured out, Zhu Xi explains, he says, sa here doesn't mean color, it means sexual desire. Right. And that is a meaning that sa can have in classical Chinese. And so what the passage means is that you should love the good as if you were being drawn to someone you're sexually attracted to. Your lust for the good should be as strong as your sensual lust, in the sense of being like very visceral and intense and automatic. And I really got that with the help of Zhu Xi. So, and I think it's defensible reading, and it makes a lot more sense than the notion that we're supposed to love the good like we love a pretty shade of blue. So Zhu Xi sometimes is really insightful about passages, but yeah, you got to take what he says with a grain of salt, because he does come equipped with this set of concepts that he got from Buddhism that skew how he reads the Confucian tradition.
Should listeners go ahead and get it on Amazon, or what's the best method to get their hands on this?
I'm happy if people get it whatever way is most convenient for them. I'm not a purist about that. So if they want to get it on Amazon, that's fine. If they want to get it directly from the Hackett Publishing website, that's fine. If they want to get it from their local independent bookstore, that's great by me too. I'm gratified however people get it.
And you mentioned that there may be a second volume coming out. If there is another volume, when would we be looking out for that?
That would be a few years down the road, because I'll have to, because this actually took me a few years to get together. And I started to write it when at Vassar, I was one of the founders of the Chinese and Japanese department. My primary appointment's in philosophy, but I also teach in Chinese and Japanese. And when we started teaching classical Chinese, we didn't have enough advanced students that we could use a regular textbook like Rouser that assumes previous familiarity with Chinese or Japanese. So I wrote this textbook just for my students. And then I kind of set it aside as the department grew and we got more advanced students. Although, as I say, I sometimes assigned it as a secondary text because students found the grammatical explanations very accessible and very clear. And then Hackett, my editor there, asked me if I had any books in works. And I said, well, I've got this textbook on classical Chinese. Nobody's going to want to read this, though. It's just too niche. And I said, but I'll show it to you. And so he said, okay, yeah, you're probably right, but I'll show it around. He showed it around and people said, we love this book. You have to complete this book. You have to publish this. Everybody who saw it thought it was a great idea. So somewhere down the road, yeah, we might do a second volume and I might do some Buddhist texts in there because there's not a lot of textbooks that really teach you about Chinese Buddhist texts.
And reading Chinese Buddhist text it's almost a different language. I've tried to, just take a look at some of them and I just don't know how to approach them. So that would be
Exactly. And so again, there's a similarity here with Latin. I mean, Latin is really a family of languages going back to the earliest language under the Roman Republic and then the Empire, but then it becomes the common lingua franca of the European world. And there's a lot of difference between, the Latin that you're going to find in Cicero versus the Latin in Augustine versus the Latin in Descartes versus the Latin that was written up until the beginning of the 20th century. And there are even newspapers still published in Latin for purists. But it's the same thing with classical Chinese. There's the language of, Mengzi and Zhuangzi and Hanfeizi, which is classical, really standard. There's the Analects, which, as you point out, I focus on the passages that are the most standard Chinese. But there are passages in the Analects that are really kind of in archaic Chinese. They're almost pre-classical, and those ones are very, very hard to read. And then you say you get a different style of Chinese in Juxi's commentary. It's closer, it's still not colloquial, but it's closer to colloquial. And then, as you point out, Buddhist philosophical Chinese, there are a lot of transliterations from Sanskrit, and you just need to know that you're looking at a transliteration, characters being used for their sound and not for their meaning because they're transliterations of Sanskrit terms. And then gradually you get Chinese versions of Sanskrit terms, but these are specialized terms and you need to know what they mean. So yeah, it's really an art just to read the different styles of classical or literary Chinese.
As we're wrapping up, thinking about this volume and the next volume, I guess this is kind of a related question. What text did you most want to put into the book that you couldn't include? And are you thinking of including that text in the second volume if you do a second volume?
Yeah, I would like to do something like the Heart Sutra,
okay.
Which is just such a popular Buddhist work in East Asia and would be a really fun thing for people to learn and also to cut their teeth on Buddhist texts. But I thought, boy, if I go into this, we're really going to be opening a whole can of worms and it's going to really delay the publication of the book. But that's something that I'm really hoping to include in the next version is some really great Chinese Buddhist text like the Heart Sutra.
Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Thank you very much, Professor Norden, for joining us on the Chinese Literature Podcast. Listeners, if you're out there and interested in working in your classical Chinese, this is a very approachable text. Go out, get it on Amazon or find it in your local independent bookstore, wherever you want to go. I highly recommend it. All right. Well, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. I'll talk to you later. Thank you, Professor Van Norden.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.